In the summer of 1943, a military train crawled across the Great Plains of Kansas under a sky so wide it made the men inside feel like they were traveling through a painting that never ended. The windows were open because the heat was unbearable, and the wind that poured through the carriages smelled like wheat and dust and something none of the passengers could name. They were not tourists, they were not immigrants. They were German soldiers, prisoners of war, being transported deeper into the heartland of a country they had been taught to despise. There were over 300 men on that train. Most of them had been captured in North Africa in the final collapse of the Afrika Korps in Tunisia in May of that year. They had surrendered not because they wanted to, but because there was nothing left to fight with. No ammunition, no water, no orders that made sense anymore. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel had already been pulled out of Africa months earlier, and the men he left behind understood, even if they could not say it aloud, that they had been abandoned. Now they sat in American train cars wearing American uniforms that had been dyed a darker shade and stamped with the letters P.W. on the back in white paint, prisoner of war. The letters felt heavier than the cloth they were printed on. Among them was a young soldier named Werner Böhm. He was 22 years old, thin, sunburned from months in the desert, with sand still embedded in the creases of his boots. Before the war, Werner had been learning to become a mechanic in a small town near Stuttgart. His father was a school teacher. His mother kept the house and grew tomatoes in the backyard. He had been called up at 19, trained for 8 weeks, and shipped to Africa before he fully understood what war meant. He understood it now. War meant thirst and fear, and the sound of tanks grinding over rocks in the dark. War meant watching men he had trained with disappear into clouds of dust and never come back. Werner sat near the window and stared at the landscape outside. He had never imagined land could look like this. In Germany, the countryside was divided into small plots, each one carefully maintained, bordered by hedgerows and stone walls built centuries ago. Here the land simply went on. Mile after mile of golden wheat stretched in every direction, broken only by the occasional farmhouse or grain silo standing alone like a lighthouse on a dry ocean. There were no bomb craters, no burned villages, no columns of refugees walking along the roads with everything they owned piled on carts. This country looked as if war had never touched it. Sitting beside Werner was a man named Klaus Dietrich. Klaus was 34, stocky, with thick hands that belonged to someone who worked with dough, because that was exactly what Klaus had done before the war. He had owned a small bakery on a working-class street in Hamburg. Every morning at 4, he would fire up the ovens and begin shaping loaves of dark rye bread, the kind that German families had eaten for generations. His wife Ingrid would arrive at 6 to open the shop, and by 7 the smell of fresh bread would fill the entire block. Their daughter Liesel had been born in 1940, the year the bombs started falling. Klaus had been drafted in 1942 and sent to North Africa. He was not a fighter by nature. He was a baker. But the Wehrmacht did not ask what you were by nature. It told you what you were now. When he surrendered with his unit outside Tunis, he felt something that surprised him. Relief. Not the relief of a coward, but the relief of a man who had been holding his breath for a very long time and could finally exhale. Before leaving North Africa, Klaus had received one final letter from Ingrid through the Red Cross. She wrote that she and Liesel had been evacuated from Hamburg to a small village in Bavaria to stay with a farming family. She wrote that the city was being bombed more frequently and that many of their neighbors had already left. She did not know what would happen to their bakery or their apartment. The letter was dated in early 1943, before the worst had come. Klaus did not yet know what the worst would be. He would not learn about Operation Gomorrah, the Allied firestorm that killed over 37,000 people in Hamburg in late July 1943, until months later, when another Red Cross letter reached him at the camp in Kansas. But even now, sitting on this train with only Ingrid's earlier letter in his pocket, Klaus understood that the life he had built in Hamburg was already disappearing. He did not talk about any of this on the train. He sat quietly, his hands resting on his knees, watching the Kansas wheat fields roll past the window. At one point, an American guard walked through the car, distributing ration boxes. Each box contained white bread, canned meat, a chocolate bar, a pack of cigarettes, and a small envelope of instant coffee. Klaus opened the box and held each item in his hands as if weighing it. Then he picked up the coffee packet and stared at it for a long time. Werner noticed. He leaned over and asked what Klaus was thinking. Klaus turned the packet over slowly. "My mother used to send me coffee from Hamburg," he said. "Real coffee from the importers near the docks. That stopped in 1940. After that, all we had was muckafuck." He paused. "You know what muckafuck is?" Werner knew. Every German knew. When the British naval blockade and wartime shortages made real coffee impossible to obtain, the German government promoted substitutes made from roasted barley, chicory root, and sometimes acorns. The result was a dark brown liquid that looked like coffee, smelled faintly like coffee, but tasted like someone had brewed a handful of dirt in hot water. People drank it because there was nothing else. They called it muckyfuck, a word that sounded vulgar, but actually came from the French macafaux, meaning false coffee. The name was perfect. Everything about it was false. Klaus held up the American coffee packet. "They are giving this to prisoners," he said quietly. "Real coffee. To men who tried to kill them 6 weeks ago." He looked at Werner, and his eyes held something that was not quite sadness and not quite wonder. "Back home, Ingrid cannot find real coffee anywhere. Liesel is 3 years old, and she has never once in her life smelled real coffee in our kitchen. And here I am on a train in the middle of America, and they hand it to me like it is nothing." Werner did not know what to say. He looked down at his own ration box and picked up the chocolate bar. It was a Hershey bar, the standard issue chocolate that every American soldier received. Werner had heard about American chocolate. The propaganda ministry in Berlin had described American consumer goods as cheap, tasteless products of a soulless industrial machine. He unwrapped the bar and broke off a small piece. The chocolate was not the finest he had ever tasted, but it was real chocolate made with real cocoa and real sugar, and it melted on his tongue with a sweetness that felt almost painful because it reminded him of a world where simple pleasures existed. Further down the train car sat a different kind of man. Friedrich Hagen, known to everyone as Fritz, was 28 years old, a lieutenant, the son of a respected Munich family. Fritz had joined the National Socialist Party at 17, before it was mandatory, before it was fashionable, because he believed in it with the fervor of a convert. He believed that Germany had been humiliated after the First War, strangled by the Treaty of Versailles, betrayed by politicians, and that only the new order could restore the nation to its rightful place. He had volunteered for the military, earned his commission, and fought with distinction in France and North Africa. Being captured was for Fritz worse than being wounded. A wound was honorable. Surrender was not. He sat rigidly in his seat, refusing to open his ration box, refusing to look at the American landscape outside the window. When one of the younger soldiers unwrapped a chocolate bar and smiled, Fritz turned to him with cold eyes and said loud enough for several rows to hear, "Enjoy it. That is exactly what they want you to do. Every bite is a small surrender." The younger soldier stopped chewing. Several men nearby shifted uncomfortably. Fritz had that effect on people. He was not physically imposing, but he carried an authority that came from absolute certainty. He never doubted. He never hesitated. In a world that had become confusing and terrifying, his confidence was magnetic, and many of the younger soldiers gravitated toward it without realizing that certainty and truth are not always the same thing. The train slowed as it approached its destination. Through the windows, the prisoners could see a cluster of low buildings surrounded by wire fencing guard towers at the corners, and beyond the fences, nothing but flat farmland stretching to the horizon. This was Camp Concordia, one of more than 500 prisoners of war camps that the United States operated during the Second World War. At its peak, the American POW system held nearly 400,000 German prisoners, a number so large that it represented one of the biggest population movements of the entire war. Most Americans at the time had no idea that hundreds of thousands of enemy soldiers were living in camps scattered across their own country from Texas to Montana, from Arizona to Wisconsin. The gates opened. The men stepped off the train into heat that hit them like a wall. Kansas in summer was brutal, the air thick and shimmering above the packed earth of the camp yard. American guards directed them toward the processing area with gestures and simple English commands. Most of the prisoners understood nothing except the pointing fingers. But one American officer stood near the gate and spoke in broken, heavily accented German. His name was Captain Robert Hastings. He was 40 years old, a history teacher from Indiana, who had been drafted and assigned to camp administration because he had studied German in college and could manage a few basic sentences. Hastings was not a combat officer. He had never fired his weapon at another human being. He had been a teacher who loved books, and the Army, in its infinite wisdom, had decided that a man who could conjugate German verbs was more useful guarding prisoners than storming beaches. Hastings stood at the gate and said in his awkward German, "Willkommen, this is not home, but it is not hell either." A few prisoners almost smiled. Most were too exhausted and confused to react. They filed through the processing line. Photographs, fingerprints, medical inspections, the issuing of camp clothing. And then they were led to their barracks, long wooden buildings with rows of bunk beds, each one equipped with a mattress, a pillow, and a blanket. Werner touched the mattress on his assigned bunk. It was thin and firm, nothing special by civilian standards. But for a man who had slept in a foxhole in the Tunisian desert for months, it felt like something from another world. He pressed his hand into the fabric and felt the resistance of the springs underneath. Then he sat down on the edge of the bed and looked around the barracks. Other men were doing the same thing, touching surfaces, testing the bunks, opening and closing the small wooden lockers beside each bed. The room smelled like fresh lumber and disinfectant. Klaus took the bunk above Werner. He climbed up, lay down, and stared at the ceiling. For the first time in months, the ceiling was not made of canvas or sky. It was solid wood, and it did not shake when artillery fired in the distance because there was no artillery here. There was no distance here. There was only Kansas and wheat and silence. That evening, the prisoners were called to the mess hall for their first meal in the camp. The building was large with long wooden tables and benches arranged in rows. American cooks worked behind a serving counter, and the prisoners lined up with metal trays moving slowly forward as food was placed on their plates. Werner watched each item appear on his tray with growing disbelief. Beef stew with chunks of real meat, mashed potatoes with butter, green beans, white bread soft and fresh, and at the end of the counter, a metal cup filled with steaming, dark liquid. Coffee. He picked up the cup and felt the warmth spread through his fingers. The smell rose toward his face, and for a moment, the mess hall, the guards, the wire fences outside, all of it disappeared. The smell was so deeply familiar, so connected to memories of mornings before the war, that it cut through everything else and reached a place in him that the war had not yet destroyed. Werner carried his tray to a table where Klaus and Fritz were already seated. Klaus was staring at his own cup of coffee the way a man might stare at a letter from someone he thought was dead. Fritz had pushed his cup to the far edge of the tray untouched. "This is psychological warfare," Fritz said. His voice was calm but carried the sharp edge of a man who needed everything to fit inside a framework he already understood. "They feed us well so we become soft, so we forget our duty, so we start to think of them as generous instead of what they really are." Klaus did not look up from his coffee. "And what are they really, Fritz?" "The enemy." Klaus lifted his cup slowly. Steam curled around his face. He took a sip, then another. He set the cup down and exhaled, and when he spoke, his voice carried something that had not been there before, a steadiness. "The enemy," Klaus said quietly, "makes very good coffee." Fritz's jaw tightened. He looked around the table as if searching for allies and found several of the younger soldiers watching him, waiting to see how he would respond. The moment hung in the air like the steam from the coffee cups, fragile and temporary. "Remember who you are," Fritz said. It was not a suggestion, it was an order. Werner sat between them, his hands wrapped around his own cup, feeling the heat penetrate his skin. He had not yet taken a sip. He looked at Klaus, who was drinking slowly, savoring something that went far beyond taste. He looked at Fritz, whose untouched cup sat at the edge of his tray like a small act of defiance against a kindness he could not afford to accept. And Werner understood in that moment that the war he would fight from now on would not be between nations. It would be between two ways of seeing the world, and both of them were sitting at his table, drinking or refusing to drink the same cup of coffee. Outside the mess hall windows, the Kansas sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of red and gold that stretched from one edge of the horizon to the other. Somewhere beyond the fences, a farmer was driving a tractor home along a dirt road trailing a cloud of dust that glowed in the evening light. The sound of the engine was faint but steady, a sound of ordinary life continuing without interruption, without fear, without the constant awareness that at any moment everything could be destroyed. Werner lifted his cup. The coffee was still hot. The bitterness hit his tongue first, followed by a warmth that spread down his throat and settled in his chest like a small fire being lit in a cold room. He set the cup down and looked at it for a long moment. He thought about his mother in Stuttgart drinking Muckefuck at the kitchen table while Allied bombers flew overhead. He thought about Liesel Klaus's daughter, who had never smelled real coffee. He thought about the enormous pot in the camp kitchen, filled to the brim as if coffee were water, as if it cost nothing, as if abundance were the natural state of the world rather than the exception. And he thought about what Fritz had said. This is psychological warfare. Maybe Fritz was right. Maybe kindness, when it comes from your enemy, is the most dangerous weapon of all. Because cruelty you can resist. Cruelty confirms everything you already believe. But kindness from the wrong direction, that is the thing that makes you question everything. Werner did not know it yet, but that question, the one forming quietly in the back of his mind, as he sat in a Kansas mess hall drinking coffee brewed by men who had every reason to hate him, that question would follow him through the months ahead, through experiences he could not yet imagine, and it would still be with him. Decades later, long after the fences came down and the guards went home, and the camp became nothing but a patch of flat ground where Kansas wheat grew over the places where prisoners once walked. But all of that was still to come. For now there was only the coffee and the silence and the enormous American sky darkening outside the windows. What none of the men at that table could have known as they sat with their cups, in their doubts, in their memories of a country falling apart across the ocean, was that something had already begun to change inside that mess hall. Not in a dramatic way, not with speeches or declarations or sudden conversions, but in the quiet, almost invisible way that a crack appears in a wall. You do not notice it at first. You do not hear it happen. But once it is there, it cannot be undone. And eventually, if enough pressure builds on both sides, the entire wall comes down. The crack in this case was a cup of coffee, and the wall was everything they thought they knew. 6 months had passed since the train from the East Coast had delivered Werner Bohm, Klaus Dietrich, and 300 other German prisoners to Camp Concordia, Kansas. It was now early 1944, and the camp had settled into a rhythm that felt almost like a small town, except that the residents could not leave, and the fence reminded them every morning that this life, however ordinary it appeared, was not freedom. In those 6 months, Klaus had received the letter he feared. A second Red Cross message from Ingrid, dated autumn 1943, told him what had happened to Hamburg. Operation Gomorrah. The Allied bombing campaign in late July had created a firestorm that killed over 37,000 civilians in a single week. The temperature at the center of the firestorm reached 800 degrees. People who could not reach shelters were pulled into the flames by winds that moved faster than a man could run. Ingrid and Liesel were safe in Bavaria. They had left Hamburg months before the bombing. But the bakery, the apartment above it, the entire street where Klaus had built his life was gone. Everything was gone. Klaus read the letter in the camp kitchen alone after his shift. He folded it carefully and put it in his shirt pocket. Then he brewed a pot of coffee, poured himself a cup, and sat at the counter for a very long time staring at the wall. He did not cry. He did not speak. He simply sat with the coffee and the knowledge that the place where he had been happiest no longer existed on the earth. Werner had changed in those 6 months in ways he could not have predicted when he first stepped off that train. His English, once non-existent, had grown into a rough but functional tool, built word by word through daily contact with American guards and farmers. He had volunteered for the agricultural labor program, which allowed prisoners to work on nearby farms for 80 cents a day, paid in canteen coupons rather than cash. The work was hard. Kansas wheat did not harvest itself, and the summer sun punished anyone who stood under it for more than a few minutes. But Werner preferred the exhaustion of honest labor to the suffocating atmosphere inside the barracks where the walls seemed to close in a little more each day, and where the politics of the camp had become as oppressive as anything he had experienced in the German military. Because the truth was that Camp Concordia was not one community, it was two. And the border between them was invisible, but as real as the wire fence surrounding the camp. On one side were the men like Werner and Klaus, men who had begun slowly and with great reluctance to question the assumptions they had carried with them from Germany. They did not wake up one morning and decide that everything they had been taught was wrong. That is not how minds change. Minds change the way rivers change the shape of stone, slowly through constant pressure applied over time through thousands of small moments that wear away at certainty until what once seemed solid begins to crumble. For Werner, those moments were everywhere. They were in the coffee served without rationing at every meal. They were in the way American guards treated prisoners with indifference rather than cruelty, as if guarding enemy soldiers was just another job, no different from working at a gas station or delivering mail. They were in the books that had begun to appear in the camp library German language volumes that included authors that the Nazi regime had banned and burned years ago. On the other side were the true believers. Fritz Hagen had organized a network of loyal soldiers, mostly younger men, and committed party members who enforced discipline and ideological purity within the barracks. They monitored who attended the discussion groups organized by Captain Hastings. They kept track of who volunteered for work details outside the camp. They noted who spoke to Americans beyond what was strictly necessary, and they punished those who crossed the line. The punishment was not always physical. Sometimes it was silence. A man who was seen laughing with an American guard might return to his bunk that evening to find that no one would speak to him. His bunkmates would turn away. His seat at the mess hall table would be taken. The message was clear without a single word being spoken. You are no longer one of us. For the men who had spent years inside a system that demanded absolute loyalty, this kind of exclusion was devastating. Identity in the German military was not individual, it was collective. You were not Werner Bohm, a young man from Stuttgart who liked to fix engines and read adventure novels. You were a German soldier. Your worth came from the group, and without the group, you were nothing. The true believers understood this instinct perfectly, and they used it like a weapon. Werner felt the pressure constantly. Every morning when he climbed onto the truck that took prisoners to the farms, he could feel eyes on his back. Every evening when he returned and walked past the bunks of men who had chosen to stay inside the camp rather than work for the Americans, he could sense the judgment. He was collaborating. He was weakening. He was choosing comfort over loyalty. But the thing that none of the true believers understood, the thing that Werner himself was only beginning to grasp, was that what he found on Harold Bennett's farm was not comfort. It was something far more dangerous than comfort. It was normalcy. Harold Bennett was 55 years old, a third-generation wheat farmer who had inherited 800 acres of Kansas flatland from his father, who had inherited it from his father before that. Harold was not a complicated man. He woke before dawn, worked until dark, attended church on Sundays, voted Republican, and believed that a man's worth was measured by the calluses on his hands and the straightness of his word. He had one son, James, who was 23 and serving with the Marines somewhere in the Pacific. Harold did not know exactly where. The military did not tell families the specific locations of their sons. It only told them when something went wrong. When the labor program began sending German prisoners to local farms, Harold had resisted. He did not want enemy soldiers on his property. His son was fighting those people's allies on the other side of the world, and the idea of feeding and working alongside them felt like a betrayal. But Harold was also a practical man, and the reality was that every young man in the county had either enlisted or been drafted, leaving the farms desperately short of labor. The wheat would not wait for the war to end. It needed to be harvested now or it would rot in the fields, and rotting wheat meant rotting income, and rotting income meant losing the farm that 3 generations of Bennetts had built. So Harold accepted the prisoners. He accepted them the way a man accepts a toothache, not with enthusiasm, but with the grim recognition that some things cannot be avoided. Werner was assigned to Harold's farm on his 3rd week of work detail. The first day was miserable. Harold communicated through pointing and grunting, refusing to use any of the basic German phrases that the labor program coordinator had taught the farmers. Werner worked in silence, hauling bales, repairing fence posts, cleaning equipment. At noon, Harold's wife, a quiet woman named Dorothy, brought lunch to the barn. She set a basket on a wooden crate, placed 2 plates, and left without making eye contact with Werner. Harold sat on one side of the crate. Werner sat on the other. They ate without speaking. But the lunch included coffee. Dorothy had brought a thermos of it, and she had placed 2 cups beside the plates. Harold poured for himself first, then almost as an afterthought, pushed the thermos toward Werner. Werner poured the coffee and lifted the cup. The smell was different from the camp coffee, richer, more complex. Dorothy, he would later learn, bought her coffee beans from a specialty shop in the nearest town and ground them fresh each morning. It was not fancy coffee by any standard, just good, honest, carefully prepared American coffee, the kind that millions of farm wives across the country made every day without thinking twice about it. Werner drank, Harold drank. They did not speak. But something in the shared silence of 2 men drinking coffee after a morning of hard work created a connection that words could not have built. It was not friendship. It was not trust. It was simply the recognition that sitting across from each other with cups in their hands, they were not a prisoner and a farmer, not a German and an American, not an enemy and a citizen. They were just 2 tired men drinking coffee in a barn while the Kansas wind pushed against the walls outside. The days turned into weeks. The weeks turned into months. Werner returned to Harold's farm 3 times a week, and slowly, like ice melting in early spring, Harold began to speak. First in single words: tractor, fence, water. Then in short sentences: that bolt is the wrong size. Rain coming tomorrow. Careful with that blade. And eventually, on a warm afternoon in late March, Harold said something that Werner did not expect. They were sitting in the barn after lunch, and Harold was looking at a photograph he had taken from his shirt pocket. Werner could see that it showed a young man in a Marine uniform smiling at the camera with the easy confidence of someone who did not yet know what war really looked like. "My boy James," Harold said. He held the photograph for a moment longer, then put it back in his pocket. "He is somewhere in the Pacific. I do not know where. They do not tell us where." Werner did not respond immediately. He understood the words, but more importantly, he understood what Harold was doing by saying them. Harold was not making conversation. He was offering something, a piece of himself, a vulnerability. He was telling a German prisoner of war about his son because the weight of not knowing where his son was had become too heavy to carry alone, and sometimes a stranger is easier to talk to than a neighbor because a stranger carries no expectations. "I hope he is safe," Werner said. His English was rough, the accent heavy, but the meaning was clear. Harold nodded once. He did not say thank you. Men like Harold did not say thank you for things like that. but the nod carried everything that the words would have carried, and Werner understood. Meanwhile, inside the camp, Captain Hastings had been quietly implementing the intellectual diversion program, the carefully named re-education initiative that the War Department had designed to reshape the thinking of German prisoners. The name was deliberately bland. The word re-education was avoided in all official communications because it sounded too much like what totalitarian regimes did. Instead, the program was framed as cultural enrichment, an offering of books, films, lectures, and discussion groups that prisoners could attend voluntarily. The key word was voluntarily. Hastings understood that forcing men to change their minds was not only ineffective but counterproductive. You cannot order someone to think differently. You can only create the conditions in which different thinking becomes possible. And the most effective condition Hastings had discovered through months of trial and error was coffee. Every Sunday afternoon, Hastings organized a discussion group in the camp's recreation hall. The topic changed each week. Sometimes it was history, sometimes it was philosophy, sometimes it was simply a conversation about what kind of country Germany should become after the war. But the thing that never changed was the coffee. Hastings had arranged for the kitchen to prepare a special batch for the Sunday sessions. It was brewed stronger than the daily rations served in ceramic cups, rather than metal ones accompanied by sugar cream and sometimes cookies that the kitchen staff baked specifically for the occasion. The message was subtle but unmistakable. This space is different. This is not the mess hall. This is not the barracks. This is a place where you can sit in a comfortable chair, drink good coffee, and think. Klaus was among the first to attend. He did not come for the ideas. He came for the coffee and the quiet. The barracks were noisy and tense, especially after dark, when the true believers held their own meetings, and the atmosphere became thick with whispered threats and enforced conformity. The Sunday discussion group was the only place in camp where Klaus felt he could breathe without monitoring what his breath sounded like. But the ideas reached him anyway. They reached him the way sunlight reaches a seed that has been buried in dark soil. Not immediately, not dramatically, but inevitably. Hastings did not lecture. He asked questions. He would place a topic on the table and then step back, letting the men talk. What does it mean to be free? Can a nation recover from what Germany has done? Is patriotism the same thing as loyalty to a leader? The questions were simple, but they detonated like small charges in the minds of men who had spent years inside a system that did not permit questions. Klaus found himself thinking about things he had not thought about since before the war. He thought about the moment in 1933 when the Nazis came to power, and his neighbor, a Jewish tailor named Herr Goldstein, had closed his shop and left the street without saying goodbye. Klaus had noticed the closed shutters, and he had felt a small prick of unease. And then he had gone back to his ovens and kneaded the dough and told himself that politics was not his business. A baker bakes bread. A baker does not get involved. But Herr Goldstein had never come back, and the shop had been given to someone else. And Klaus had never asked where Herr Goldstein went because asking that question would have meant answering it, and answering it would have meant knowing, and knowing would have meant that silence was no longer ignorance, but complicity. These thoughts came to Klaus during the Sunday discussions sitting in a chair with coffee in his hands, and they did not feel like revelations. They felt like debts, things he owed to himself and to the people he had failed by choosing not to see. Werner began attending the discussions in April. He came reluctantly, slipping into the back of the room and taking the chair closest to the door as if he might need to leave quickly. He was still afraid of being seen. The true believers had eyes everywhere, and their capacity for punishment had recently been demonstrated in a way that Werner could not forget. 2 weeks earlier, a prisoner named Helmut Vogel, 25 years old from Dresden, had been found behind the barracks with a swollen eye and a split lip. His crime was reading an American newspaper that he had found in a guard's trash can. Fritz had personally organized the beating. 3 of his men had dragged Helmut behind the building after dark, and the sounds of fists hitting flesh had carried through the thin walls of the barracks with a clarity that made every man inside a witness, whether he wanted to be or not. Werner had been lying in his bunk when the sounds began. He heard the first impact, then a muffled cry, then the steady rhythm of blows landing on a body that had stopped resisting. His muscles tensed, his jaw clenched. Every instinct told him to get up to go outside to do something, but he did not move. He lay in the dark and listened and did nothing, and when the sounds finally stopped and the silence returned, the silence was worse than the beating had been because the silence was his. He had chosen it. He owned it. Helmut appeared at breakfast the next morning with his injuries visible. He sat down at a table near the edge of the mess hall, and no one sat with him. No one asked what happened. The bruise on his face was a message written in a language that every prisoner could read, and the message said that questions had consequences. Werner looked at Helmut across the mess hall and felt the shame of his own inaction settle into his chest like a stone. It was still there when he walked into the Sunday discussion group and sat down and wrapped his hands around a cup of coffee and tried to focus on the conversation instead of the voice in his head that kept asking why he had done nothing. Hastings noticed Werner immediately. The captain had developed an instinct for reading the men who came to his sessions. Some came out of genuine curiosity, some came for the coffee, some came because they had already changed and were looking for confirmation that they were not alone. And some, like Werner, came because they were in the middle of changing, caught between two versions of themselves, and the tension of standing in that middle ground had become unbearable. One Sunday in late April, Hastings read aloud from a German novel. The book was All Quiet on the Western Front by Erich Maria Remarque, the most famous anti-war novel ever written in the German language, a book that the Nazis had publicly burned in 1933 because its portrayal of war as meaningless suffering contradicted the myth of glorious sacrifice that the regime needed its citizens to believe. Hastings read a passage in which the narrator, a young German soldier in the First War, sits in a shell crater with a French soldier he has just stabbed and watches the man die slowly over several hours. The narrator talks to the dying man. He apologizes. He promises to write to the man's family. And he realizes in the horror of that crater that the enemy is not an enemy at all, but a mirror. A man exactly like himself who was born on the wrong side of a line drawn by people who would never sit in a crater with anyone. The room was silent when Hastings finished reading. 20 men sat with their coffee cups and said nothing. Werner's hands were trembling slightly, though he hid it by pressing his palms against the warm ceramic. He knew this book. His father had kept a copy hidden in the attic of their house in Stuttgart, tucked behind a box of old-school papers where no one would think to look. When Werner was 15, his father had taken the book down one evening and read several chapters aloud to him in the kitchen with the curtains drawn and the radio playing music to cover the sound of the forbidden words. His father had looked at him over the top of the book and said, "Remember this. Remember what war really is, because someday they will try to make you forget." Werner had forgotten. The training had made him forget. The uniform had made him forget. The shouted orders and the marching songs and the propaganda films had all worked together to bury the memory of his father's voice reading those words in a dark kitchen. But now, sitting in a recreation hall in Kansas, hearing the same words read by an American captain with a terrible German accent, the memory came back with a force that felt physical, like a fist pressing against his chest from the inside. He did not cry. He did not speak. He simply sat and drank his coffee and felt the crack in the wall inside him grow a little wider. The confrontation that had been building for months finally came on a night in early May. Fritz had been tracking the growing number of prisoners attending Hastings' Sunday discussions, and the list of names made him furious. Klaus Dietrich was on that list. So was Werner Bohm. So were dozens of others. In Fritz's mind, these men were not seeking knowledge or processing difficult questions. They were surrendering. They were allowing the enemy to dismantle their identity one cup of coffee at a time, and the fact that they seemed willing, even grateful, made the betrayal worse. Fritz called a meeting in the barracks after lights out. About 30 men gathered in the darkness, sitting on bunks and standing in the narrow aisles, their faces barely visible in the faint light that came through the windows from the guard tower searchlights. Fritz stood at the center and spoke in a low voice that carried the absolute conviction of a man who had never once in his life considered the possibility that he might be wrong. He named names. He called out the men who attended the discussion groups. He called them weak. He called them traitors. He said that when Germany won the war, and he still believed Germany would win, these men would face consequences. And then he turned directly to Klaus, who was sitting on his bunk with his hands folded in his lap, and said, "You, the baker, you sit in that room every Sunday drinking their coffee and nodding along to their propaganda like a trained dog. You disgrace every man in this barracks." And the silence that followed was the kind that precedes either violence or something more dangerous than violence. Every man in the room held his breath. Klaus did not move for several seconds. Then slowly he stood up. Klaus was not a tall man, and he was not an imposing man. He was a baker with flour permanently embedded in the creases of his knuckles and a quiet way of moving through the world that most people mistook for passivity. But when he stood up in that dark barracks and faced Fritz, something in his posture changed. His shoulders squared, his chin lifted, and when he spoke, his voice carried not anger, but a weariness so deep it sounded like authority. "Fritz," he said, "I have lost my bakery. I have lost my home. Hamburg is burning. My wife and my daughter are hiding somewhere in Bavaria, and I do not know if they are alive or dead. My street does not exist anymore. The ovens where I baked bread for 15 years are buried under rubble." He paused, and the pause was not for effect. It was the pause of a man who needed a moment to hold himself together before continuing. "You stand here and threaten me. Tell me, Fritz, what exactly can you take from me? I have already lost everything. The only thing you cannot take is my right to think with my own mind, and I will not give that up. Not for you, not for anyone." The barracks went completely silent. No one moved. No one breathed. The searchlight from the guard tower swept across the windows, sending a bar of white light sliding across the floor and up the wall and disappearing, leaving the room darker than before. Fritz stared at Klaus. His jaw worked as if he were chewing on a response that he could not quite form. He was accustomed to obedience. He was accustomed to fear. What he was not accustomed to was a man who had nothing left to lose and therefore nothing left to fear. Klaus's defiance was not the defiance of a rebel or a hero. It was the defiance of a man who had been stripped of everything except the ability to choose what he thought, and who had discovered in the stripping that this last possession was the only one that mattered. Several prisoners in the darkness shifted on their bunks. Not all of them agreed with Klaus. Not all of them were ready to think the thoughts that Klaus was thinking. But something had cracked in the room. Fritz's authority depended on the assumption that every man in the barracks feared him more than they feared the alternative. And Klaus had just demonstrated that fear has a limit, and that limit is the point where a man has lost so much that the threat of losing more becomes meaningless. Fritz said nothing. He turned and walked back to his bunk. The meeting was over, but the fracture it left behind was not. 3 weeks later, the American military authorities implemented the policy that had been under discussion for months. The most committed Nazi elements in the camp system would be transferred to higher security facilities. Camp Alva in Oklahoma had been designated for the most dangerous and ideologically rigid prisoners, the men who had resisted all efforts at re-education and who continued to terrorize their fellow prisoners. Fritz Hagen was on the transfer list. So were the 3 men who had beaten Helmut Vogel. On the morning of the transfer, Fritz found Werner in the yard near the barrack. Werner was sitting on the wooden steps drinking a cup of morning coffee, watching the guards load equipment onto the trucks that would carry the transferees away. Fritz walked up and stood over him, blocking the sun so that his shadow fell across Werner's face. "You think their coffee is free?" Fritz said. His voice was quiet but sharp, like a blade being drawn slowly from a sheath. "Everything has a price, Boom. Their food, their books, their smiles. The price is your soul, and you are paying it one cup at a time. Werner looked up at Fritz. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Werner said, maybe, or maybe the price of your certainty is higher than anything they are charging. Fritz's eyes narrowed. He held Werner's gaze for 3 seconds, then turned and walked toward the waiting trucks. Werner watched him climb into the back of the vehicle, watch the tailgate close, watch the truck pull through the camp gates and turn onto the highway. The dust from the tires hung in the air for a long time after the truck had disappeared, and Werner sat on the steps and drank his coffee and felt both lighter and emptier, as if a rope that had been holding him to something familiar had just been cut, and he was not yet sure whether he was floating or falling. With Fritz gone, the atmosphere in Camp Concordia changed. The tension did not vanish overnight, but it eased the way a headache eases when you finally unclench your jaw. The Sunday discussion groups grew larger. Men who had been afraid to attend now came openly. The camp library saw more traffic. Conversations at the mess hall tables became longer and more honest. And something else began to circulate through the barracks. A small, carefully printed newspaper called Der Ruf, which means the call. It was part of the re-education program, though the prisoners who read it did not always know that. Der Ruf was edited by two remarkable men, both of them German prisoners of war held in the American camp system. The first was Alfred Anders, a writer and intellectual who had deserted from the Wehrmacht because he could no longer participate in a war he believed was criminal. The second was Hans Werner Richter, a soldier who had been captured in North Africa and had undergone his own slow transformation in American captivity. Anders and Richter were not ordinary prisoners. They were men of ideas, men who understood that the war would end eventually, but that the war inside German minds would continue long after the last bullet was fired. Der Ruf published essays about democracy, individual responsibility, the future of Germany, and the moral obligations of ordinary citizens in a society that had committed extraordinary crimes. The writing was careful, intelligent, and aimed directly at the men sitting in barracks across America who were beginning to ask themselves the same questions that Klaus asked during the Sunday discussions. Klaus obtained copies of Der Ruf through the camp library, where Hastings had discreetly placed them among other German language materials. He would read the articles at the kitchen counter after his shift, turning the pages slowly, while a cup of coffee sat beside him growing cold. The essays named things he had been avoiding. They asked questions he had been refusing to answer. And they did it in German, in his own language, which meant he could not dismiss them as foreign propaganda. These were German voices speaking to German minds about German failures. And the honesty of that conversation was more powerful than anything Captain Hastings could have said. One article stayed with Klaus for days. It was about the concept of Mitschuld, a German word that means shared guilt. The article argued that guilt for what the Nazi regime had done did not belong only to the leaders who gave the orders or the soldiers who carried them out, but also to the millions of ordinary citizens who saw what was happening and chose to look away. The baker who continued baking while his neighbor disappeared. The teacher who continued teaching the approved curriculum while books burned in the square outside. The mother who continued setting the table while the radio announced new laws that stripped people of their rights. Klaus read that article and set it down and stared at the wall of the kitchen for a very long time. He thought about Herr Goldstein's shuttered shop. He thought about the silence that followed, and how silence, when it is chosen, is not the absence of sound, but the presence of agreement. Spring turned to summer. The camp continued its routines. Men worked, ate, slept, argued, read, played soccer on the dirt field behind the barracks, and drank coffee at every meal. The coffee had become more than a beverage. It had become a kind of calendar marking the days and the hours, giving structure to a life that otherwise had no structure. Morning coffee meant another day had begun. Afternoon coffee meant the worst heat had passed. Evening coffee meant the day was ending and sleep would come soon. One afternoon in late June, Werner arrived at Harold's farm and found something different. Dorothy was waiting at the barn door, which she had never done before. Her face carried an expression that Werner could not read, and she held a glass of water toward him with both hands as if the act of offering it required her full concentration. Werner took the glass and looked past her into the barn. Harold was sitting on the wooden crate where they usually ate lunch, but he was not eating. He was holding a piece of paper, a telegram, and his hands were trembling. Dorothy touched Werner's arm briefly and lightly, and then walked back toward the house without speaking. Werner stepped into the barn. Harold did not look up. The telegram rested in his fingers like something fragile that might disintegrate if gripped too hard. Werner stood a few feet away, unsure of what to do, unsure of what the telegram contained, unsure of whether his presence was welcome or intrusive. He was, after all, a prisoner, an enemy. The trembling hands of this American farmer were not his business. But Werner did not leave. Instead, he walked to the shelf where the coffee thermos sat, the thermos that Dorothy had filled that morning, as she did every morning, and he poured 2 cups. He carried them to the crate and set one down in front of Harold. Then he sat down across from him and waited. Harold finally looked up. His eyes were red. "My boy," he said. "James, he was hit at Saipan, shrapnel." He paused, and the pause lasted long enough for Werner to feel the full weight of what the next words might be. Then Harold exhaled. "He is alive. They are sending him to a hospital in California. His leg is bad. They do not know if he will walk right again. But he is alive." Werner felt something shift inside his chest. The relief was not his to feel, but he felt it anyway. He had never met James Bennett. He had only seen the photograph in Harold's shirt pocket, the young man with the easy smile. But in that moment, James was not an abstract American soldier. He was a boy whose father sat in a barn in Kansas with shaking hands, and the terror of losing a child was the same terror in every language and on every side of every war. Werner pushed the coffee cup closer to Harold. Harold looked at it, then looked at Werner, and something passed between them that neither of them would ever describe to anyone because it existed in a space beyond words. A German prisoner of war was offering coffee to an American father who had just learned that his son was wounded, and the offering was not a gesture of pity or diplomacy or even kindness. It was a gesture of recognition. One human being acknowledging another human being's pain and saying without speaking, "I see you. I am here. This is all I can do. But I am here." Harold picked up the cup and drank. His hands were still trembling, and a small amount of coffee spilled over the rim and ran down the side of the cup and onto his fingers, but he did not wipe it away. He just drank, and Werner drank, and the barn was quiet except for the sound of the wind moving through the wheat outside. The weeks that followed brought a development that no one in the camp had anticipated. News from Europe grew more dramatic with each passing day. In early June 1944, the event that would determine the course of the war arrived. Werner was at Harold's farm when it happened. They had finished the morning work and were sitting in the barn for their usual lunch. Dorothy had brought the thermos and the 2 cups, and Werner was pouring coffee when Harold reached over and turned on the radio that sat on a shelf above the workbench. The voice of the CBS correspondent came through the speaker, crackling with static and urgency. Allied forces had landed on the beaches of Normandy. Operation Overlord, the largest seaborne invasion in history, was underway. American, British, Canadian, and Free French troops were storming the coast of France under heavy German fire. Casualties were reported to be severe. The liberation of Europe had begun. Werner set the thermos down. His hand was steady, but something inside him was not. He listened to the broadcast without understanding every word, but he understood enough. The Americans had invaded France. The Western Front was now open. Germany was being squeezed from both sides, the Soviets from the east, the Allies from the west. The war that Fritz had insisted Germany would win was being lost in real time, narrated by a calm American voice on a radio in a Kansas barn, while 2 men sat with coffee cups in their hands on opposite sides of a wooden crate. Harold listened with his eyes closed. When the broadcast paused, he opened his eyes and looked at Werner. There was no triumph in his expression, no satisfaction. Harold was a man who had already nearly lost his own son to this war. And he knew that invasion meant casualties, and casualties meant that somewhere in France or the Pacific, young men who looked like James were dying at that very moment. My boy is in the Pacific, Harold said. Not France, he paused. But you have friends over there. Werner nodded slowly. He thought about the men he had trained with in Germany before being shipped to North Africa. Some of them had been reassigned to France. Some of them were probably on those beaches right now on the other side of the bullets. He did not know their names anymore. War had a way of erasing names, but he remembered their faces, and he knew that some of those faces were now looking up at the sky for the last time. Harold stood up. He took the thermos and poured more coffee into both cups. The gesture was simple, but carried the weight of everything that neither man could say. Harold was pouring coffee for a young man whose former comrades were at that moment trying to kill Harold's countrymen on a beach 4,000 miles away. And Werner was accepting the coffee from a man whose son was fighting against the allies of the country Werner had sworn an oath to defend. War is a cruel business, Harold said, and the words came out heavy as if each one had been carried a long distance before being spoken. It takes men who ought to be sitting together drinking coffee and turns them into people who have to kill each other. Werner wrapped his hands around the cup. The warmth felt different now. Not comforting, not simple. The warmth felt complicated, the way everything felt complicated when you started seeing the people on the other side of the war as people rather than targets. Back at camp, the news of D-Day hit the prisoners like a shockwave. Some men wept. Some sat in stunned silence. Some refused to believe it, insisting that the invasion would be repelled, that the Atlantic Wall would hold, that the Fuhrer had secret weapons that would turn the tide. But most of the prisoners, especially the older ones, who had seen the overwhelming industrial power of the American military firsthand, understood what Normandy meant. It meant the end, not today, not tomorrow, but soon. Klaus spent that evening in the kitchen. He brewed a pot of coffee larger than usual and carried it to the recreation hall where small groups of prisoners had gathered in the stunned quiet that follows catastrophic news. He did not say anything about the invasion. He did not offer analysis or predictions. He simply placed cups on the tables and poured coffee for anyone who wanted it. Some men drank in silence. Some talked in low voices. A few sat alone staring at nothing, processing the realization that the country they had fought for was disappearing in real time. Klaus poured and poured until the pot was empty. Then he went back to the kitchen and brewed another one. It was the only thing he knew how to do. He was a baker. He made things that sustained people. And on a night when everything felt like it was falling apart, a cup of coffee was the closest thing to solid ground that he could offer. The months that followed moved with a terrible momentum. Paris was liberated in August. The Allies pushed eastward through France and into the Low Countries. The Soviet army advanced from the east. Germany was shrinking on the map week by week. In December, Hitler launched his final gamble, the Battle of the Bulge, a massive counteroffensive through the Ardennes forest. For a few days, the remaining true believers in the camp whispered that the tide was turning. But the Bulge collapsed within weeks, and with it, the last credible argument that Germany could win. And then in the spring of 1945, the camps were found, the concentration camps, the death camps, the places whose names would become synonymous with the worst crimes in human history. Buchenwald, Dachau, Bergen-Belsen, Auschwitz. American and British troops liberated them one by one, and the photographs and film footage that emerged showed the world something that many people, including many Germans, claimed they had never known. Hastings arranged for a documentary film about the liberation of the camps to be shown to all prisoners. Attendance was mandatory. Every man in the camp would sit in the recreation hall and watch what had been done in the name of the country they had fought for. The screening took place on a warm evening in late April. The hall was packed. Men sat on chairs on benches on the floor. The lights went down. The projector hummed, and then the images appeared on the screen. Skeletal bodies stacked like firewood. Mass graves filled with tangled limbs. Survivors who looked more like ghosts than human beings staring at the camera, with eyes that had seen things no eyes should ever see. American soldiers walking through the camps with handkerchiefs pressed to their faces because the smell of death was so overwhelming that trained combat veterans who had fought through Normandy could not breathe without gagging. The room reacted in waves. Some men turned away, some covered their faces. Some made sounds that were not words, but something more primitive, the sounds of men whose understanding of the world was being destroyed in real time. A few stood up and left. Others sat frozen, unable to look away. Werner watched without moving. His hands were in his lap, and between them he held a cup of coffee that he had carried into the screening out of habit. But now the cup felt wrong. The warmth of it felt wrong. Everything felt wrong. The images on the screen were not abstract. They were the logical conclusion of the ideas that he had marched for, fought for, and nearly died for. The regime that had fed him, trained him, given him a uniform and a purpose, had also built those camps and filled them with human beings and turned them into smoke. When the film ended and the lights came back on, Werner looked down at the coffee in his hands. The surface of the liquid was still. His own face stared back at him from the dark circle of the cup, distorted and unrecognizable. He placed the cup on the floor beside his chair very slowly, as if it had become impossibly heavy, and he stood up and walked outside without picking it up. The Kansas sky was the same sky he had watched for nearly 2 years, enormous and indifferent and full of stars. He stood alone near the barracks wall and breathed and tried to find solid ground inside himself, but the ground was moving. Did I know? The question formed in his mind with a clarity that frightened him. Did I see things and choose not to understand them? Did I hear things and choose not to listen? Was I ignorant or was I something worse? He did not have answers. He would not have answers for a long time. But the questions were there, now planted in the same soil where the coffee and the books and the Sunday discussions had already been working, and those questions would grow in ways he could not yet foresee. Inside the recreation hall, Klaus was doing what he always did when the world became unbearable. He was in the kitchen brewing coffee. He filled a large pot, carried it to the hall, and placed cups on the tables for anyone who needed something warm to hold. He did not speak about the film. He simply poured and sat down beside the men who could not bring themselves to go back to the barracks yet. A young soldier near the back of the room was crying silently, his shoulders shaking. Klaus walked over, set a cup of coffee in front of him, and sat down in the next chair without saying a word. The young man eventually picked up the cup and held it with both hands, and the warmth seemed to anchor him just enough to stop the shaking. Klaus sat with him until the shaking stopped completely, and then he stood up and poured coffee for someone else. Klaus understood something that night that he had been circling around for months. Coffee in this place and at this moment had become something more than a drink. It had become an act of presence, an act of saying without speaking that he was here, that they were all here, and that whatever guilt or horror or confusion they were carrying, they did not have to carry it alone. The coffee grew cold in the cups. The men sat without speaking. Outside, the Kansas wind moved through the wheat fields with a sound like breathing steady and endless. The war in Europe would end in 11 days, but the war inside these men was only beginning. The 8th of May, 1945, arrived not with a bang, but with a radio announcement that crackled through the speakers in the mess hall during breakfast. Germany had surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe was over. The American guards cheered. Some threw their caps in the air. Others shook hands and slapped each other on the back with the relieved laughter of men who knew that the dying, at least on one side of the world, had finally stopped. A cook in the kitchen turned up the radio, and the sound of celebration poured through the serving window, along with the smell of eggs and coffee. The German prisoners did not cheer. They sat at their tables and stared at their trays and said nothing. Some lowered their heads. Some continued eating mechanically, as if the act of chewing and swallowing could somehow hold together a world that had just collapsed around them. The silence at the German tables was not grief exactly, and it was not shame, though both were present. It was the silence of men who had lost the last thread connecting them to the version of themselves they had been before. They were no longer soldiers of the Wehrmacht. They were no longer defenders of the Reich. They were no longer anything. They were just men sitting in a cafeteria in Kansas, eating American eggs, drinking American coffee, wearing American clothes stamped with the letters P.W., and the country they had sworn to protect no longer existed in any form they would recognize. Werner sat at his usual table with Klaus beside him. The coffee in Werner's cup had gone cold, but he kept his hands wrapped around it because the ceramic felt solid, and solid things were hard to come by that morning. He watched the American guards celebrating and felt something he had not expected. Not anger, not resentment, envy. He envied them the simplicity of their joy. For them, the war ending was unambiguously good. Their side had won. Their cause had been just. Their sacrifices had meaning. They could go home and tell their children that they had fought for freedom and defeated tyranny, and the story would be true and the truth would be clean. Werner could not tell a clean story. His story was tangled with guilt and confusion and questions that did not have satisfying answers. He had fought for a regime that built death camps. He had worn the uniform of an army that carried out atrocities. He had followed orders from leaders who had led an entire nation into a catastrophe so complete that the very word Germany now carried the weight of crimes that would take generations to reckon with. And the fact that Werner himself had never committed an atrocity, had never even seen a concentration camp, did not make him feel innocent. It made him feel something worse. It made him feel ignorant, and ignorance, he was beginning to understand, was not the absence of guilt, but its most common disguise. Klaus drank his coffee with deliberate attention, using the ritual as an anchor against the current of thoughts that threatened to pull him under. He was thinking about Ingrid and Liesel. He was thinking about Hamburg, which no longer existed as the city he remembered. He was thinking about the bakery, which was now a hole in the ground. And he was thinking about a question that the end of the war had finally brought to the surface. What do I go back to? The question was not only practical, though the practical dimensions were terrifying enough. No home, no business, no savings, no tools. But the question went deeper. What kind of man walks through the door when I return? The man who left Hamburg in 1942 believed that if he kept his head down and baked his bread and did not ask questions, the world would leave him alone. That man was wrong. The world did not leave anyone alone. It came for everyone eventually, and the only question was whether you faced it with your eyes open or closed. Klaus set down his cup and looked at Werner. "The war is over," he said. Werner nodded. "But the real question is just starting." Klaus continued. "What do we become now?" Werner did not answer. He did not have an answer, but the question settled into the space between them, and it would remain there through everything that followed. The weeks after VE Day were disorienting. The camp continued to operate, but its purpose had evaporated. The prisoners were no longer enemies. They were not yet free. They existed in a space between war and peace, between captivity and liberty, between the men they had been and the men they would need to become. The routines continued out of inertia. Men woke, ate, worked, returned, ate again, slept. The coffee was brewed at the same times. The guards patrolled the fence, though now they seemed less like sentries and more like caretakers of a population that had nowhere to go. News from Germany arrived through letters, radio broadcasts, and newly arriving prisoners who had been captured in the final weeks of the war. The picture they painted was devastating. Cities destroyed, millions homeless, famine spreading, the country divided into 4 occupation zones, and the full horror of the Holocaust being exposed to the world, branding the name Germany with a shame that would outlast everyone in that camp. In June, the repatriation program began. Nearly 400,000 German prisoners spread across more than 500 camps, needed to be transported back to Europe. The process required ships' trains, processing centers, medical examinations, and a classification system that sorted prisoners based on their political reliability. Those identified as genuinely reformed men who had participated in the re-education program and renounced Nazi ideology were cleared for early repatriation. Those who remained committed to National Socialism were held longer, transferred to facilities where more intensive re-education would continue. The irony was brutal. The men who had changed were being sent back to a country bombed into rubble where food was scarce and coffee was a distant memory. The men who refused to change were kept in camps with regular meals, warm beds, and coffee. The reward for growth was hardship. The reward for stubbornness was comfort. Werner and Klaus were classified in the first group. Their records showed consistent participation in the discussion program, positive evaluations from Hastings, and clean files. They would be among the first to leave. Werner spent his final weeks doing two things. He continued working at Harold's farm, and he spent his evenings in the recreation hall with Klaus and a small group of men who had become something like friends, though none of them would have used that word. They were men who had been through something together, and the something was not the war, but what happened after it, the slow, painful process of becoming different people. On his second to last day in camp, Werner walked to Harold's farm for the final time. The August heat was thick, and the wheat fields had been harvested, leaving the land looking bare and exposed. Harold was waiting by the barn door, which was unusual. Normally, he was already at work when Werner arrived, but today he was standing still, leaning against the frame with his hands in his pockets and a look on his face that Werner had never seen before. It was the expression of a man who was about to say goodbye and did not have a vocabulary for it. Harold had words for weather and machinery and crop yields and the price of wheat. He did not have words for this. Dorothy was there too, standing a few steps behind Harold, holding a dishcloth in her hands that she kept folding and unfolding. She looked at Werner and gave him a small nod, the first direct acknowledgement she had ever offered him, and in that nod was everything she had never said during the months he had eaten lunch in her barn and drunk coffee from her thermos. Werner walked up and stood in front of Harold. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence was the same silence that had accompanied their lunches for months, the silence of two men who had learned to communicate without words. "I am leaving tomorrow," Werner said. Harold nodded. "I know." Harold reached into the barn and brought out a small package wrapped in brown paper. He held it for a moment, then extended it toward Werner. "For your mother," he said. Werner took the package. It was heavier than it looked. He opened one corner of the wrapping and saw dark brown coffee beans, freshly roasted, packed tightly into a paper bag. Half a pound, maybe a little more. Werner understood what this package represented. Coffee in post-war Germany was nearly impossible to obtain. The country's supply chains were destroyed, its ports in ruins, its currency worthless. A half pound of real coffee beans was worth more than money. It was a tangible fragment of American abundance wrapped in brown paper by the calloused hands of a man who had every reason in the world to hate him and had chosen not to. "I cannot accept this," Werner said, though his fingers tightened around the package even as he spoke. "You can and you will," Harold said. His voice carried the finality of a man who was not accustomed to having his decisions questioned. "Coffee is not a gift you refuse." Werner looked at Harold's face. The farmer's eyes were steady, but there was moisture at the edges, the kind that a man like Harold would never acknowledge and would deny if anyone mentioned it. Werner thought about everything that had passed between them. The silent lunches, the shared coffee, the afternoon when Harold held the telegram about James and his hands would not stop trembling. The day they listened to the D-Day broadcast together, sitting on opposite sides of a war, drinking from the same thermos. "James," Werner said. "How is he?" Harold's face changed. The tightness around his eyes softened. "He is home. Took some shrapnel in the leg at Saipan. He will walk with a limp for the rest of his life, but he is home. Harold repeated those last three words as if they were the most important words in the English language. He is home. The weight of all those months of not knowing, the long nights, wondering whether the next telegram would begin with, "We regret to inform you," all of that weight was released in those three words. "He is alive," Werner said. "He is alive," Harold confirmed. Werner extended his hand. Harold took it. The handshake was firm and brief, the way handshakes are between men who understand that prolonging the gesture would make it too much to bear. Harold released Werner's hand and stepped back. Dorothy moved beside her husband and put her hand on his arm, and the gesture was so quiet and so natural that it told Werner everything about who these people were and what their life together looked like. "Go home," Harold said. "Fix things." Werner turned and walked toward the road where the military truck was waiting. He did not look back. He knew that if he did, he would see Harold and Dorothy standing together by the barn watching him leave, and the image would be too much to carry on top of everything else. The package of coffee sat in his hands like a small warm stone. That evening, Werner and Klaus and about 40 men scheduled for the first repatriation transport gathered in the recreation hall. No one organized the gathering. The men simply drifted toward the hall the way people drift toward light when darkness is coming. Klaus arrived early. He had spent the afternoon in the kitchen preparing one final pot of coffee. He had done this hundreds of times, but tonight he paid attention to every step as if performing the ritual for the first and last time simultaneously. He measured the grounds. He heated the water to exactly the right temperature. He watched the dark liquid fill the pot with the patience of a man who understood that some rituals deserve full attention, especially when you know you will never repeat them. He carried the pot to the recreation hall and set it on the central table. Then he went back for cups, sugar, and cream. By the time the men arrived, the table was set and the smell of fresh coffee filled the room. Werner came in and took his usual seat. Harold's package of beans was tucked inside his jacket close to his chest. He also had the portion of ground coffee that he had been saving from his camp rations over the past weeks, a small stash he had accumulated, knowing that real coffee would be impossible to find in Germany. He had not told anyone about Harold's gift yet. It felt like something private, though he could not explain why. Klaus poured for everyone. The men sat in small groups talking quietly. Some exchanged addresses. Some talked about what they would do when they got home. Rebuild. Find work. Find family. Start over. The words were optimistic, but the voices were not. Hastings came to the gathering. He walked through the room, shaking hands with men whose minds he had watched change over 2 years. He stopped at Werner's table and sat down. Werner looked at him and said in the best English he could manage, "Captain, I want to thank you, not for the coffee, although the coffee was very good." He paused, searching for words precise enough to carry what he meant. "Thank you for the books my country burned. You gave them back to me." Hastings looked at Werner for a long moment. His face showed the fatigue of a man who had spent 2 years doing work that most people would never understand. Re-educating enemy prisoners did not produce medals or promotions. It produced changed minds, and changed minds were invisible from the outside. "Go home," Hastings said. "Build something better." It was the same thing Harold had said. Go home. Fix things. Build something better. Two different men, a farmer and a teacher, giving the same instruction. The work ahead was not abstract. It was concrete. One brick at a time, one conversation at a time, one cup of coffee at a time. Klaus sat across from Werner after Hastings left. The two men had been through something together that neither fully understood yet. They had arrived as soldiers of a defeated army, carrying beliefs planted by a regime that understood better than almost any government in history how to control what people thought. And over 2 years through coffee books, questions, silence, hard work, and the stubborn kindness of people who had no obligation to be kind, those beliefs had been dismantled. Not destroyed, dismantled, taken apart piece by piece, examined and found to be hollow. The process was not complete. It would never be complete. Werner would carry questions about his complicity for the rest of his life. Klaus would carry the weight of shared guilt in the same hands that carried bread dough and coffee pots. Neither would fully reconcile the young men they had been with the older men they were becoming. But the gap between those two selves was where growth happened, and growth even painful was better than the alternative. The alternative was Fritz, sitting in a high-security camp in Oklahoma, still refusing American coffee, still insisting Germany would rise again, still building walls inside his mind to keep out the truth. Fritz was not growing. Fritz was calcifying, and calcification was not strength. It was the inability to bend, which meant that when enough pressure was applied, the only option was to break. The gathering lasted until late evening. Men drank coffee and talked and sat in silence, and eventually returned to their bunks. Klaus was the last to leave. He washed the pot, dried the cups, wiped down the table, and turned off the lights. As he stood in the doorway looking back at the empty room, he thought about all the cups of coffee that had been consumed in that space over 2 years, thousands. Each one a small moment of warmth in a cold situation, a small gesture of normalcy in a world that had gone insane. He closed the door and walked to his barracks in the dark. The next morning, the repatriation transport assembled in the camp yard at dawn. Military trucks idled near the gate engines, rumbling in the cool air. The prisoners carried small bags with their few belongings. Those staying behind watched from the barracks windows. Werner and Klaus climbed into the same truck. They sat on the wooden bench in the back shoulder to shoulder as the truck pulled through the gate and turned onto the highway. Through the open back of the truck, Camp Concordia shrank behind them, the guard towers growing smaller, the fence becoming a thin line, and then disappearing entirely swallowed by the Kansas landscape. Neither spoke for a long time. The road unwound behind them and the wheat fields stretched in every direction under a sky that seemed to go on forever. Warner thought about the first time he had seen this landscape from the train window nearly 2 years ago and how foreign it had seemed. Now it felt almost familiar. Not home, never home, but a place that had shaped him in ways he was only beginning to understand. The journey east took several days. Trains and trucks carried the prisoners to a port on the Atlantic coast, where a military transport ship waited. Werner and Klaus stood on the deck as the ship pulled away from the American shore. The land grew smaller behind them, a dark line on the horizon that thinned and faded until there was nothing left but water and sky. Klaus took out his journal. He had been writing in it for over a year. On this final American page, he wrote, carefully pressing the pencil hard against the paper as if he wanted the words to be permanent. We came here as defeated soldiers. We leave as men who are trying to find themselves again. Between those two moments, there were 1,000 cups of coffee, and each cup taught us something. The enemy on the map is not always the enemy at the table, and sometimes the most dangerous weapon is not a gun or a bomb, but a simple act of kindness that you did not expect and cannot explain. He closed the journal. The ship moved eastward through the gray Atlantic swells, carrying its cargo of changed men toward a destroyed country that needed them to be different from the men who had left it. The ship docked at Le Havre, France. The port city had been heavily damaged during the liberation, and the scars of war were visible everywhere. Bombed buildings, craters in the roads. The prisoners were transferred to trains for the final leg into Germany, and as the train crossed the border, the damage intensified. Werner pressed his face against the window and watched his country pass by in fragments. Cities that had been names on a map were now ruins. Bridges had been blown into rivers. Railroad stations were nothing but twisted steel frames over piles of rubble. People walked along the roads carrying bundles, pushing carts, moving with the slow determination of survivors who had nowhere specific to go but could not stand still. Klaus sat beside him, watching the same destruction. Neither spoke. Words were not adequate. This was not the Germany they had left. This was a country that had tried to conquer the world and been conquered in return, thoroughly and completely. until there was nothing left but the people and the ground they stood on. The train stopped at a junction where the repatriation authorities had set up a processing center. The prisoners were officially discharged, given papers, and released. Klaus and Werner stood outside the gate and looked at each other. Klaus was going south toward Bavaria. Werner was going west toward Stuttgart. Their paths diverged here. Klaus reached into his bag and took out a small package. Werner recognized it. Coffee. Klaus had saved his last camp rations, hoarding the grounds over his final weeks, tucking them into a paper envelope folded tight and compact. He divided the coffee into 2 equal portions and handed one to Werner. "When you get home," Klaus said, "brew this for your family. Then tell them. Not about the war, tell them about the coffee." Werner took the package. Between the beans from Harold and the grounds from Klaus, he now carried 2 small parcels of coffee, each one given by a different person, each one representing a different kind of connection that the war had made impossible, and that simple human decency had made real. "I will," Werner said. They shook hands. Klaus turned south. Werner turned west. They walked in opposite directions along a dirt road that cut through a landscape of ruins, each carrying coffee and the full weight of 2 years that had changed them in ways they would spend the rest of their lives trying to understand. Werner arrived in Stuttgart 3 days later after walking hitchhiking and riding on the back of a farmer's cart through miles of destroyed countryside. The city was barely recognizable. Entire neighborhoods had been flattened. Streets were filled with rubble, pushed to the sides to allow passage. Buildings stood like broken teeth, facades intact, but interiors gutted by fire. He found his parents' house on a street near the eastern edge of the city. It was still standing, though one wall had been damaged and patched with boards and scrap metal. The front door was the same door he remembered, scratched and weathered, but intact. He stood in front of it for a long moment, holding his bag in one hand and the 2 packages of coffee in the other. He knocked. The door opened and his mother stood there. She was thinner than he remembered. Her hair had gone gray at the temples. She looked at him for a full 3 seconds without recognition, because the young man who had left at 19 was not the same person standing on her doorstep at 25. His face was harder. His eyes were older. Then she recognized him, and the sound she made was not a word. It was something older than language, a sound that came from the place inside the body where love and grief and relief all lived together. She pulled him through the doorway and held him, and Werner dropped his bag and wrapped his arms around her and felt for the first time in years the specific warmth of being held by someone who had known him before the war. His father appeared from the back of the house. The school teacher walked with a slight limp from injuries sustained when the school was bombed. His face showed surprise, then joy, then something more complex, the expression of a father who sent a boy away and received a man in return. Werner stepped back from his mother and held up Harold's package. "I brought something," he said. His mother took the package and opened it. When the smell of the coffee beans reached her, she stopped moving. Her hands went still. For a moment, she stood in the hallway of her damaged house holding half a pound of American coffee beans. And she was not a woman in a ruined city. She was the woman she had been before the war, standing in her kitchen on an ordinary morning while sunlight came through the window above the sink. Her eyes filled with tears. "Where did you get this?" she whispered. "From a farmer in Kansas," Werner said. "An American named Harold. His son was fighting in the Pacific while I worked on his farm. He gave me the coffee on my last day and told me to bring it to you." His mother held the beans and let the tears come because the coffee was not just coffee. It was proof that somewhere in the world, even after everything that had happened, a stranger could choose kindness over hatred, and that single choice was enough to make the world feel slightly less broken. Then Werner took out the second package, the grounds from Klaus. "And this is from a friend," he said, "a baker from Hamburg. He told me to brew it for you and then tell you a story. Not about the war. About the coffee." His mother went to the kitchen and began to boil water. She ground Harold's beans by hand using an old grinder that had survived the bombing because it had been stored in the cellar. The sound of the grinder filled the house, a rhythmic crunching that Werner had not heard in years, but recognized instantly the way you recognize a song from childhood. She mixed the fresh grounds from Harold's beans with the camp coffee from Klaus, combining them in a single pot, and the two sources of coffee merged into one dark stream that smelled of Kansas farmland and Kansas mess halls and the long journey between them. The smell spread through the house. It moved through the hallway into the living room where his father sat, into the bedroom where the curtains were drawn against the dust from the ruined street. His mother carried 3 cups to the table, ceramic cups with a blue floral pattern that had once been part of a set of 6 but was now 3 because the others had been broken during a bombing raid. The family sat down together in a kitchen that smelled like coffee for the first time in 4 years, and for a long moment nobody drank. They sat with their hands around the cups and breathed in the steam and allowed the smell to carry them backward in time to a morning when the world was still whole. Werner's mother took the first sip. She set the cup down and pressed her fingertips against her lips, and when she looked at Werner, she was smiling through tears. "It tastes like before," she said. "It tastes like before everything." Werner's father lifted his cup and drank slowly, and then he set it down and put his hand on his son's shoulder, and the weight of that hand said everything that a school teacher from Stuttgart could not find words for. Werner drank last. The coffee was a blend of 2 gifts, 2 friendships, 2 acts of generosity that had no business existing in a world at war, but existed anyway. It tasted like Kansas wheat fields and camp kitchens and the quiet patience of a farmer who poured coffee for his enemy every afternoon for a year. It tasted like Sunday discussions and forbidden books and the courage of a baker who stood up in a dark barracks and refused to be afraid. It tasted like the distance between who he had been and who he was becoming, and that distance was bitter and warm at the same time. 500 miles to the south, Klaus Dietrich arrived at a small village in the Bavarian countryside. The village was largely untouched by bombing, its stone farmhouses and church steeple standing intact against green hills that looked almost offensively peaceful after the destruction he had seen on the journey south. He walked through the village, asking for the woman and child from Hamburg, and an elderly woman pointed him toward a farmhouse at the edge of the village near a stream. Klaus walked up the dirt path and knocked on the door. A woman he did not recognize opened it, looked at his papers, and called over her shoulder. Ingrid appeared in the doorway. She was thinner, her hair pulled back sharply, her face angular. But her eyes were the same eyes that had looked at him across the counter of their bakery, and when she saw him, those eyes filled with years of separation and uncertainty and fear. She did not run to him. She stepped forward and put her hands on his face, tracing his jawline, his cheekbones, the bridge of his nose. She was reading him, searching for the man she had married inside the stranger who had returned. "Klaus," she said, just his name. "I am here," he said. Behind Ingrid, a small face appeared at the level of her waist. Liesel, 5 years old, dark hair, serious expression. A child who had learned too early that the world was not always safe. She looked up at the tall man and did not speak. She did not recognize him. She had been 2 when he left. He was not a memory to her. He was a word her mother used sometimes, a concept without a face. Klaus knelt down until his eyes were level with hers. He did not reach for her. He did not try to hug her or pick her up. He understood that trust could not be demanded. It could only be offered and waited for. "Hello, Liesel," he said. The girl looked at him with those serious eyes and said nothing. Klaus stood up, reached into his bag, and found his remaining portion of coffee. He looked at Ingrid. "I will tell you everything," he said, "but first let me make coffee." Ingrid led him to the kitchen, a simple room, wood-burning stove, stone sink, scrubbed table. Klaus found a pot, filled it with water, set it on the stove. He opened his envelope and carefully tapped the grounds into the water, watching the dark powder dissolve and stain the surface. The grounds were the last of his American rations, saved across weeks in an ocean for this moment. The smell began to build. Faint at first, then stronger, filling the room the way morning light fills a house when the curtains are open after a long night. rich and dark and unmistakable. Ingrid stood by the counter. She had not encountered real coffee since 1941. For 4 years, she had drunk nothing but the grain substitute that every German knew and no German missed. The sudden presence of this smell in the kitchen connected her to a life she had nearly forgotten, and she turned away for a moment and pressed her hand against her mouth. And then from the doorway, a small voice. "Papa, what is that smell?" Klaus turned. Liesel was standing in the kitchen entrance. She had followed them from the front of the house, drawn by the aroma. Her nose was wrinkled slightly, and her head was tilted to one side in the universal gesture of a child encountering something entirely new. She had never smelled coffee. She had been born into a world of substitutes, and the real thing was as foreign to her as the man who was making it. But she had called him Papa. The word came out naturally, pulled from somewhere instinctive. She had seen her mother look at this man with trust, and a 5-year-old understands trust even when she does not understand war or prison camps or the distance between Kansas and Bavaria. The word was not recognition. It was faith. The faith of a child who understood without language that the man making the kitchen smell warm and good must be the same man whose name her mother whispered at night when she thought Liesel was asleep. Klaus poured 2 cups, one for himself, one for Ingrid. He held his cup for a moment, feeling the warmth, the same warmth he had felt hundreds of times in the camp kitchen at Concordia. But it meant something different now. In Kansas, the coffee had been a crack in a wall. Here in this kitchen with his wife and daughter, the coffee was a foundation, the first brick of something new. He sat down. Ingrid sat across from him. Liesel climbed onto the bench beside her mother and leaned against her, watching the steam rise from the cups with wide, curious eyes. Klaus drank. The taste was the same. The bitterness, the warmth spreading through his chest, the finish that lingered. But the meaning had transformed. This was not a prisoner's coffee anymore. This was a father's coffee, a husband's coffee, a beginning. He set down his cup and looked at Ingrid. "I have a story to tell you," he said. "It is about a camp in a place called Kansas, and a captain who asked questions and nobody wanted to answer, and a farmer who gave coffee to his enemy, and a wall that came down 1 cup at a time." Ingrid wrapped her hands around her own cup and waited. Outside, the Bavarian evening settled over the village. The stream ran through the meadow with a sound like quiet conversation. The hills turned purple. A church bell rang, marking the hour the way it had marked hours for centuries, indifferent to wars and borders, and the small, enormous changes happening inside a kitchen, where a man was telling his wife how he lost one world and found another. Liesel fell asleep against her mother's shoulder before the story was finished, her small hand resting on the table near her father's cup. Klaus noticed and lowered his voice, and the story continued in a near whisper, the way all the most important stories are told. Years later, long after Camp Concordia was closed and its buildings torn down, and the land returned to wheat long after Harold Bennett passed away on his farm and was buried beside Dorothy in the small cemetery behind the Lutheran church, long after Captain Hastings went back to teaching history in Indiana and never spoke publicly about what he had done, the memory of those years survived. Alfred Indersch, the editor of Der Ruf, returned to Germany and continued publishing, turning the newspaper into one of the most important literary voices of post-war Germany. Hans Werner Richter, his co-editor, founded Group of 47, the literary circle that would shape German writing for decades and produce Nobel Prize winners Heinrich Böll and Günter Grass. Both men credited their time in American captivity as the experience that transformed them from soldiers into thinkers, from followers into writers. The re-education program remained controversial. Some historians called it a success, arguing that the democratic values planted in the minds of nearly 400,000 prisoners helped build the foundation for West Germany's transformation into one of Europe's most stable democracies. Others called it propaganda, differing from the Nazi version only in method. The truth lived in the complicated space between those positions the way truth usually does. But for the men who lived through it, the program was not an abstraction. It was a series of small, specific, deeply personal moments. A cup of coffee in a mess hall, a book read aloud by a captain with a terrible accent, a handshake at a barn door, a package of beans wrapped in brown paper, a daughter's voice saying Papa for the first time. These moments did not end the war. They did not rebuild Germany. They did not answer the moral questions that the century had raised. But they proved that change was possible, that a man taught to hate could learn to question, that a wall built from propaganda and fear could be taken down not by force but by patience and coffee and the slow, stubborn insistence on treating enemies like human beings. Werner Boehm never returned to Kansas, but for the rest of his life, he drank his coffee, black brewed strong in a large pot poured without ceremony. His wife, whom he married in 1948, learned to make it the way he liked it without ever fully understanding why a German man preferred his coffee the American way. Werner never explained. Some things cannot be explained. They can only be tasted. Klaus Dietrich rebuilt his bakery, not in Hamburg, which took decades to recover, but in the Bavarian village where Ingrid and Liesel had waited. The bakery was small, a single oven, and a counter facing the street, but it produced the same dark rye bread he had baked in Hamburg. And beside the bread, Klaus always kept a pot of coffee for customers who wanted to sit and talk. The coffee was brewed strong, the cups were ceramic, and on the wall behind the counter in a small wooden frame hung a photograph from Camp Concordia, taken by an American guard, showing the mess hall kitchen with the large coffee pot on the stove and steam rising toward the ceiling. No customer ever asked about the photograph. It was just a picture of a kitchen. But Klaus looked at it every morning when he opened the shop, and every morning it reminded him of the same thing. That sometimes the most powerful force in the world is not a weapon or an army or an ideology. Sometimes it is just a cup of coffee offered to the right person at the right moment in a place where no one expected kindness and everyone needed it.